A son interrupts his mother's wedding and begs her to flee, but no one expected what he heard. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what city you're from. Naomi adjusted the silk scarf around her neck as she stepped into the sunlight pouring through the kitchen window. Morning light filtered through sheer curtains, casting gentle gold patterns across the countertops and the worn wood floors. The scent of cinnamon and coffee mingled in the air, comforting, familiar. She stood still for a moment, one hand resting on the table, the other curled around her favorite chipped mug, as she watched her son, Caden, spooning cereal into his mouth with the distracted urgency of an 8-year-old lost in thought. He was growing fast. Already taller than most boys his age, with the same proud cheekbones and almond-shaped eyes as his mother. He looked up at her now, giving a sleepy smile, milk trailing down his chin. Naomi returned the smile, small and soft, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Today marked the last Friday before her wedding. The word still felt strange in her mouth, like trying on a dress one size too small. Wedding, marriage, husband. They weren't unfamiliar concepts, not after years of witnessing failed ones from the sidelines. But this time it was her turn, her second chance, her first real one. Ryan had swept into her life like a summer storm, sudden, intense, and impossible to ignore. He was everything her ex had not been: stable, mature, financially secure, and attentive. She had met him at a charity fundraiser nearly a year ago, where he'd stood out like a lighthouse in a sea of pretense. While others had looked through her, seeing only the single mother and black entrepreneur with a modest cosmetics line, Ryan had approached her like she mattered, and that had been the first warning sign. But Naomi, exhausted from carrying everything on her own shoulders for too long, had missed it. Or maybe she had simply chosen to look away. Their romance unfolded with cinematic precision. Late-night phone calls, spontaneous weekend trips, thoughtful gestures, and an ease in conversation that lulled her into trust. He had even connected with Caden in a way that caught her off guard. He asked about school, remembered his favorite color, took him out for burgers and movies. For months she had watched, tense, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it hadn't. Not yet. The proposal had come 6 months after they met, under a sky dripping with stars on a balcony overlooking Lake Tahoe. Naomi had cried, overwhelmed by the surrealness of it all. She had said yes, believing, for the first time, that someone had chosen all of her, not despite her son, not as a second option, but as the center of a future. Now, the wedding was just days away. Ryan had insisted on taking over the planning. "You've done enough in your life, Naomi. Let me do this for you," he had said, cupping her face in his hands. "This is your moment to breathe." And she had agreed, because truthfully, she was tired. Tired of juggling motherhood and business, tired of negotiating every part of her existence. Letting someone else shoulder the responsibility felt divine. But even divinity can wear a mask. As the week unfolded, Naomi found herself swept into a whirlwind of fittings, bridal parties, cake tastings, and emails she didn't send. Everything was being arranged at breakneck speed, much of it without her input. Ryan's assistant, a young woman named Marcy with a clipped tone and frosty smile, seemed to know more about Naomi's wedding than Naomi herself. "It's just efficiency," Ryan had said when she expressed concern. "We're planning a 3-month job in 3 weeks. Trust me." So she tried. Still, late at night, as she lay beside him and listened to his even breathing, her eyes would remain open, tracing the outline of shadows on the ceiling. The venue was a private estate 2 hours outside the city, an expansive vineyard-turned-event center, with white stone pillars, marble fountains, and winding trails. Ryan had chosen it without consulting her. "You'll love it," he promised. "It's timeless, elegant, just like you." Her friends had varying reactions to the whirlwind. Some were thrilled. "Girl, you finally got yourself a king," one had said, fanning her face. Others were more cautious. "Something about him feels rehearsed," another whispered over wine one evening. Naomi had laughed it off, calling it nerves. Even Caden had voiced his own kind of unease, though it came in the form of questions. Why does Ryan always have people with him? Why did he say we don't need to bring anyone from your work to the wedding? Why did he get mad when I asked if you were keeping your name? She had answered with as much honesty as she could muster, but sometimes silence became easier than the truth she didn't yet want to name. And now, sitting in the quiet kitchen on a sunny morning, Naomi felt the press of all those unsaid things gather like a storm cloud at the edge of her mind. She shook it off, forcing a smile as she reached over to wipe a spot of cereal from Caden's cheek. "You excited for Sunday?" she asked. He shrugged, then gave a small nod. "Yeah, I guess. Are you?" She hesitated. "I am." And she was, or at least she wanted to be. That afternoon, she drove to Final Dress Fitting. The boutique was tucked into a quiet neighborhood of restored brownstones, with golden chandeliers and soft jazz playing in the background. As she stood on the platform in front of the mirror, surrounded by satin and tulle, Naomi tried to picture herself walking down the aisle. The image refused to form. Instead, her mind wandered to practicalities. Did she leave the invoices at home? Were Caden's shoes polished? Did she send that thank you note to the mentor who helped fund her business 5 years ago? She was still mentally checking off items when the seamstress gently adjusted the bodice and said, "There, now you look like the happiest woman in the world." Naomi smiled, but the reflection didn't smile back. That evening, Ryan called to say he'd be staying in the city overnight to finalize logistics with his brother and their event team. She didn't question it. Just nodded, told him to get rest, and hung up before the silence between them stretched too far. Caden curled up on the couch beside her, feet tucked under a blanket, watching a cartoon he barely paid attention to. "Mom?" he asked suddenly. "Yes, baby?" He hesitated. "Can I stay close to you on the wedding day?" She turned to look at him, surprised. "Of course. You're walking me down the aisle, remember?" He nodded but didn't smile. "Okay." Naomi felt her heart twist. She didn't know what it meant. Maybe he was just nervous. Maybe they both were. That night, she dreamt she was standing in the vineyard, alone. Her dress was blowing in the wind, her veil tangled around her wrists. In the distance, laughter echoed, but it was hollow, and every time she turned to find the source, all she saw were shadows. When she woke, the room was dark, and Caden was curled beside her, his tiny hand gripping hers like a lifeline. The next morning, she received a gift box from Ryan. Inside was a lavender robe, pearl earrings, and a handwritten note. "To my beautiful bride, I can't wait to see you walk toward me. You've already given me everything I've ever wanted." Naomi held the note in her hands for a long time. Something in the words made her pause. Everything I've ever wanted. She should have felt flattered, but instead, a quiet unease curled in her chest. On the surface, everything was flawless. And that was exactly what made it feel so wrong. As the final hours before the ceremony approached, Naomi tried to quiet the questions in her mind. She told herself that anxiety was natural, that Caden's questions were just a child's worries, that Ryan's intensity was simply love expressed in grand gestures. But deep down, in the parts of herself that had survived disappointment, betrayal and rebuilding, a whisper had begun. Something isn't right. She didn't know then that her son would be the one to prove it, and that the lie she had wrapped herself in so tightly would begin to unravel not with a scream, but with a small voice and a shaky hand holding a phone. The storm hadn't passed. It had only just begun. The morning sun crept through the gauzy curtains of the guest suite in the Vineyard estate, spilling soft light over the room's antique furniture. Naomi opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the quiet brightness. For a brief moment, she lay still, cocooned in linen sheets surrounded by the faint fragrance of roses drifting in from the terrace. It was her wedding day, or at least that was what she reminded herself. She rose quietly, careful not to wake Caden, who was curled in the twin bed across the room, his dark curls tangled against the pillow. He had insisted on sleeping in the same room as her, even though a room had been prepared just for him. Naomi hadn't argued, not after the way he had clung to her last night, his arms wrapped tightly around her waist without explanation. She had felt it, too, that tug of unease, a sense of something just out of reach, pressing at the edge of her thoughts. She padded to the bathroom, washed her face, and stared at her reflection in the ornate mirror above the sink. The woman staring back at her looked elegant, well-rested, composed, but Naomi knew better. Her skin held tension beneath the surface, and her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She pressed 2 fingers against her temples, inhaled slowly, then turned back to the bedroom. The door creaked open just as she slipped on her robe, and Marcy's crisp voice pierced the morning stillness. "Good morning, Naomi. We're starting makeup and hair in 30 minutes. Breakfast will be brought up shortly. You'll love the smoothie. We used your favorite berries." Naomi blinked, disoriented by the speed and brightness with which the young woman entered the room. "Thanks, Marcy," she murmured, glancing toward Caden, who stirred under the blankets. "Ryan says to remind you not to worry about a thing today. Everything is taken care of," Marcy added with a smile that felt memorized. "He's already downstairs with his brother and the event planner. They've got the schedule down to the minute." Naomi forced a nod, her stomach fluttering not with excitement, but something murkier. She was used to managing every detail of her life, schedules, Caden's schoolwork, business inventory, taxes. But this entire event was being conducted like a symphony, every note preordained by someone else's baton. As the door clicked shut behind Marcy, Naomi exhaled. She turned to Caden, who now sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes. "You okay, baby?" she asked. He nodded but didn't speak. Naomi crossed the room and sat beside him, brushing a curl from his forehead. His skin was warm, his brow slightly furrowed. "You don't have to be in the ceremony if you don't want to," she said gently. "We can change things." Caden looked at her then, those deep, searching eyes boring into her. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the knock on the door came too soon. Hair and makeup had arrived. The next few hours passed in a blur. Brushes swept across her skin, hands adjusted her shoulders, jewelry was fastened around her neck. Naomi tried to focus on the positive. Her dress was breathtaking. The earrings Ryan had sent sparkled delicately against her collarbone, and the sunlight made everything seem unreal in the best possible way. She smiled, posed, and nodded in all the right places. But beneath the performance, her chest tightened with each passing moment. Something was wrong. Or maybe she was just imagining it. She had a tendency to overthink, especially when it came to Caden's well-being. Maybe she was projecting. Still, she couldn't help noticing how all the staff, Servers, decorators, photographers seemed unfamiliar, even robotic. No one made small talk. No one addressed her by name. They moved with synchronized efficiency, as though following a script. By noon, the estate was transformed. The ceremony space in the central courtyard was adorned with cascading white roses, imported orchids, and endless rows of gold-trimmed chairs. A string quartet played softly near the fountain, and guests began to arrive in black town cars, stepping out in silk, chiffon, and designer heels. Naomi stood near the window in her suite, watching it all unfold below. Everyone looked so polished, so perfect. But they didn't look like her people. She had invited close friends, of course she had, but as she scanned the crowd she recognized very few faces. Where was Melinda? Where were her sorority sisters? Had they not made it? Had their invitations even been sent? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock. This time it was one of the groomsmen, a tall man with a square jaw and an earpiece that seemed oddly out of place. "Miss Thompson," he said smoothly, "Ryan asked me to escort your son to the groom suite to rehearse the ring handoff." Naomi hesitated. "I thought the rehearsal was yesterday." "He just wants a quick run-through," the man said, flashing a benign smile. "Nothing to worry about." Caden walked up slowly, clutching the little satin pillow that held the symbolic rings. Naomi knelt down to him, brushing her hands across his shoulders. "You sure you're okay, baby?" He nodded, still quiet, still serious. She kissed his forehead. "I'll see you in a bit." He followed the groomsmen out the door, and it closed with a gentle click behind them. Naomi sat down in the velvet armchair by the window and folded her hands in her lap. A strange chill slid across her back. She didn't know where it came from. Downstairs, Ryan was greeting guests with practiced charm. He wore a white tuxedo with a black lapel, a red pocket square perfectly folded. His smile was radiant, but his eyes flicked across the crowd with calculation. To those who didn't know him, he appeared the doting groom, basking in his moment. In truth, he was watching the clock. And Caden, at that moment, was not in the groom's suite. He had slipped away from the groomsmen near the side garden, ducking behind a hedge the moment the man's back turned. Something had drawn him, instinct perhaps, or something less definable. He had felt it building for days, an undercurrent of wrongness threading through every laugh, every gesture. And now, with the ceremony just minutes away, he couldn't ignore it. He found the room by accident. A side door left ajar, muffled voices rising from within. He crept closer, heart pounding. Inside, he heard Ryan's voice, not the cheerful tone he used at dinner. This one was low, cold, laced with cruelty. "Once she signs the license, the paperwork goes through. Then we hit her with the audit. She'll never see it coming. By the time she figures it out, we'll already have transferred the brand assets." Another man laughed. "And the kid?" "He's just a pawn," Ryan said dismissively. "A prop to make her feel safe. I'll handle him." Caden's breath caught in his throat. He crouched down, pulling the old phone from his pocket. It was the one his grandfather had given him, barely working except for the voice recorder app he liked to play with. He pressed record, hands trembling as the voices continued. "We have to move fast," another man said. "The investors want the assets under our name before the end of the quarter." "She won't know what hit her," Ryan said. Caden didn't wait to hear more. He backed away quietly, carefully, then turned and ran. His small shoes pounding across the marble floor, down the corridor, past the kitchen, where staff bustled with trays of champagne and desserts. He didn't stop until he reached the door to his mother's suite. He pounded it with his fists. Inside, Naomi stood frozen, halfway through pinning her veil. The makeup artist stepped back in alarm as Naomi turned toward the door. "Caden," she called. The door burst open. Her son's face was pale, his chest heaving, eyes wide with something Naomi had never seen in him before: terror. "We need to go," he said, voice shaking. "Now." Naomi blinked, confused. "What happened? What's wrong?" "They're gonna hurt you," he said, thrusting the phone into her hands. "I heard them. I recorded it. They said they're going to take everything. Ryan's lying. They're all lying." Naomi stared at him, disoriented. Her heart thudded. She opened the recording. She listened. And in that moment, the veil in her hand slid to the floor. Her mouth went dry. Outside, the music swelled. The ceremony was about to begin. And everything, every fantasy, every promise, every plan was about to fall apart. For a long moment, Naomi didn't move. The phone trembled slightly in her hand, its cracked screen displaying the active recording. The voices on the other end played clearly, Ryan's voice unmistakable, calm and confident as he plotted to ruin her. The words sliced through her like broken glass. "She trusts me. We'll take everything. The boy's just a prop." Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her knees felt unsteady beneath her, like the floor might give way at any moment. This couldn't be real. Not here. Not now. Not on the day she was supposed to begin the rest of her life. Caden stood before her, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, his hands clenched into tiny fists. His eyes searched hers, silently begging her to believe him. There was no trace of his usual boyish mischief, no nervous fidgeting, just raw fear and determination. Naomi turned the volume up and listened again, as if hoping the words would somehow change the second time. They didn't. Each sentence only confirmed the horrific truth. Her fiancé had never loved her. He had never loved Caden. Everything, the charm, the care, the promises, had been a carefully constructed performance leading up to this very day. Her wedding was not the beginning of something beautiful. It was the climax of a con. The door behind her creaked as the makeup artist leaned forward, confused by the tension in the room. Naomi held up one hand, silencing her without words. Then she stepped closer to Caden, her fingers wrapping protectively around his shoulder. "How long ago did you hear this?" she whispered, kneeling to meet his gaze. "Just now. I ran here as fast as I could," he stammered. Naomi nodded slowly, mind racing. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She didn't need to hear more. She didn't need to ask what came next. Her instincts, sharpened by years of being a mother, kicked in before logic could catch up. They had to leave. Now. She rose to her feet and crossed the room to the small armoire by the mirror. Inside, her flat shoes from earlier that morning were tucked beneath the hem of the gown bag. She stepped out of her heels with a grace that belied the panic forming beneath her skin and slid her feet into the sneakers, pulling the laces tight with fingers that had begun to tremble. The makeup artist moved closer again, concern etched across her face. "Is something wrong?" Naomi didn't answer. Instead, she took Caden's hand in hers and squeezed it firmly. There wasn't time to explain. The moment they stepped out of the suite, the noise of the wedding washed over them. Violin strings, murmuring voices, the clink of glasses, laughter. Down below, guests were already beginning to take their seats in the courtyard. White petals covered the aisle like snow, and Ryan stood at the altar checking his watch, his posture as composed as ever. Naomi's grip on Caden's hand tightened. They moved quickly but quietly, slipping through a side hallway that led away from the bridal suite and toward the staff access doors. Naomi's mind tried to calculate a way out, but every corridor felt like a trap. She didn't know the estate. She hadn't been allowed to oversee logistics. Ryan and his people had controlled every detail. And now she understood why. They turned a corner and nearly collided with one of the catering staff, an older man carrying a tray of champagne flutes. Naomi muttered an apology and kept walking, her eyes scanning for cameras, for exit signs, for anything that might help them get out. Caden tugged at her arm. "Mom, I think the back kitchen has a door that opens to the parking area. I saw it when we came yesterday." She nodded. "Lead the way." As they moved deeper into the interior of the estate, the guests grew quieter behind them, the sounds of the ceremony dimming. In the empty service hallway, Naomi caught sight of a figure up ahead. A groomsman, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing an earpiece. Her pulse quickened. That was the man who had taken Caden earlier. The same man who had lied to her. Without thinking, she yanked her son into a nearby storage room, pressing her back against the door as it closed with a soft click. The scent of cleaning supplies and dust filled the small space. Naomi held her breath, listening for footsteps. They passed, slowly, then faded. She exhaled shakily and turned to her son. "We're going to get out of here. I promise." Caden nodded, his face pale but steady. Naomi leaned her forehead against his for a second. It was all she had time for. They slipped out again and made their way down a narrow passage, eventually reaching a double-swing kitchen door. Naomi pushed it open cautiously and peeked inside. The room was bustling with activity. Chefs, servers, assistants, all moving in tight, efficient patterns. She hesitated. If they were part of Ryan's plan, exposing themselves here could be dangerous. But then she saw a line cook near the back, her posture stiff, arms crossed over her chest. A black woman, mid-40s, dreadlocks pulled into a bun. Their eyes met across the room. Naomi didn't speak. She didn't have to. Something unspoken passed between them. The woman gave the smallest of nods and tilted her head toward the emergency exit. Naomi squeezed Caden's hand and bolted forward, weaving through tables and carts. Shouts followed behind them. Someone had seen. Someone was reacting. But she didn't look back. The door burst open and bright sunlight flooded her vision. The rear gravel lot lay ahead, empty except for a few delivery trucks and utility vans. Her dress caught on the threshold as she ran, ripping at the hem. She didn't care. She kept running, her feet pounding against the gravel, pulling Caden beside her with every ounce of strength she had. Behind them, the kitchen door slammed again. This time, footsteps followed. Naomi didn't turn. She had no energy for fear. Her only focus was distance. Distance between them and whatever waited inside that estate. They reached the edge of the parking lot, breath ragged, lungs burning. Naomi scanned the area. No open gates, no unlocked cars. Her vision blurred. She reached into her bra and pulled out her phone, barely hanging on to signal. She hit the emergency contact for Melinda. No answer. Then she remembered. Caden's recording. "Who did you send it to?" she gasped, turning to him. "I texted it to Mr. Carter. He was in your contacts." Naomi froze. Detective Carter. An old friend. He had been a neighbor years ago before moving to the city. She hadn't spoken to him in months, but if he had the recording... Suddenly, the air behind them shifted. She turned just in time to see two men in dark suits exiting the rear of the estate and heading their way. Ryan's men. They weren't running. Not yet. But their pace was steady, direct. Caden saw them too. "We have to go." Naomi looked around again. Nothing. No car, no key. Then, on instinct, she did the only thing she could. She grabbed a metal trash bin from beside the nearest wall and shoved it down the hill behind the estate. It clattered noisily, crashing into shrubs and drawing attention. The men broke into a jog. Naomi grabbed Caden and ran in the opposite direction, looping around the corner of the building and back toward the central courtyard. She didn't have a plan. Only movement. Only survival. And then, music. She burst out into the edge of the ceremony space, gasping for air. Guests turned in confusion as she stumbled into view, her wedding dress torn, hair disheveled, one hand clutching her son's, the other holding the phone like a weapon. Ryan stood at the altar, a look of horror overtaking his carefully composed face. Naomi stopped. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "This wedding is over." The words hung in the air like smoke. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Caden stepped forward beside her. He raised the phone, opened the file, and hit play. Ryan's voice filled the courtyard, cold, calculated, damning. "She trusts me. We'll take everything." Guests turned, faces shifted, murmurs turned to accusations, and then, from the far drive, the wail of sirens began to rise. Naomi didn't smile. She just stood tall, her son beside her, and waited for the reckoning to begin. For a moment, there was only silence. The recording continued to play, each word cutting through the stunned hush of the courtyard. Naomi stood at the edge of the aisle, her chest heaving, her dress in tatters, her hair no longer pinned but tumbling around her shoulders. Her grip on Caden's hand was firm, grounding her as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. The guest, who had moments before been sipping champagne and murmuring about the perfection of the venue, now sat frozen, their expressions twisting from confusion to shock to disbelief. Ryan didn't move. He stood at the altar, expressionless, the tips of his fingers still grazing the edge of his cufflinks. Naomi could see the faint twitch in his jaw, the clench of muscles beneath his carefully tailored tuxedo. For the first time, the mask he had so meticulously crafted began to slip. The recording ended. The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Someone at the back of the seating area stood abruptly. A woman in a pearl necklace turned to the man beside her and whispered furiously. An elderly guest looked down at her hands as if unsure whether they had just applauded a ceremony or a performance of betrayal. Ryan finally took a step forward, his face rearranging itself into a show of pained understanding. "Naomi," he said softly, like a man comforting a child, "I don't know what you think you heard." "Don't," she snapped, her voice low but cutting. "Don't you dare lie to me. Not now. Not in front of all these people." He stopped mid-step, something cold flickering in his eyes. "This is a misunderstanding." He tried again, but his tone was different now, sharper, less controlled. "I think you're overwhelmed. You've had a lot of pressure on you. Everyone has. Planning a wedding." Naomi raised the phone again. "Should I play it again? Maybe louder this time?" A ripple of murmurs moved through the guests. Caden clung to her side. Naomi glanced down at him and felt the fire in her bones return. She had been played for a fool, but not anymore. Not while her son stood beside her, brave and unwavering. Ryan looked past her, toward the entrance of the estate. Two of his groomsmen, men she now realized were more like bodyguards than friends, had begun to move, subtly at first, making their way down the aisles with tight expressions. "We need to leave," Naomi whispered to Caden, her voice nearly drowned by the growing buzz of the crowd. "Now." They turned toward the exit, but it was too late. The two men picked up speed, breaking into a stride. One of them called out, "Miss Thompson, please, we need to speak with you for a moment." Naomi didn't hesitate. She grabbed Caden and ran. The path leading away from the courtyard curved around the side of the estate and toward a small rose garden Naomi barely remembered from the venue tour. Her feet pounded against the cobblestones, the dress snagging on every edge, the train tearing behind her like a flag of retreat. Caden ran beside her without a word, his tiny hand clenched tightly in hers. Behind them, the footsteps quickened. Shouts echoed through the garden. Somewhere, someone screamed. Naomi's lungs burned. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind knew better. If they were caught now, it wouldn't end with apologies or explanations. The look in Ryan's eyes had confirmed everything. He wasn't trying to save face. He was trying to silence her. They veered down a side path lined with hedges, ducked under a wooden arch, and burst into a small, unkempt greenhouse. Naomi slammed the door shut behind them and threw the bolt, pressing her weight against the frame. Outside, the men's footsteps slowed. "Naomi," one of them called, calm and condescending, as if speaking to a frightened animal. "You're overreacting. Let's just talk. You're going to ruin everything." Caden looked up at her, his face pale but determined. Naomi didn't answer. She pulled out her phone and checked the time. She prayed that Detective Carter had received the message, prayed that he was on his way. Suddenly, a loud crash against the door made her jump. The wood groaned, splinters flying. "We don't have much time," she whispered to Caden. "We need another way out." They scanned the greenhouse. Dusty glass panes lined the roof, vines wrapped around old steel supports. In the far corner, a rusted door stood partially ajar, leading to what looked like a tool shed or possibly a maintenance path. She didn't wait to analyze. She grabbed Caden and sprinted toward it, just as the main door behind them splintered. They burst out into open sunlight again, this time into a narrow utility trail lined with stacked crates and garden tools. The air smelled like fertilizer and metal. It led to the southern edge of the estate, the farthest point from the ceremony. Naomi could see a break in the hedges ahead, a glimmer of road beyond. "We're almost there," she panted, but luck was not on their side. A van rolled into view just beyond the bushes, black and unmarked, its engine low and steady. A man in a driver's uniform stepped out and looked directly at her. His expression didn't change. He reached for something at his waist. She didn't stop to see what it was. "This way," she cried, dragging Caden to the right, down a slope that led into the vineyard rows. The vineyard was vast, acres upon acres of grapevines stretching in perfect symmetry. It was both a blessing and a curse. There were places to hide, yes, but also places to trap. The rows were narrow, uneven, and difficult to maneuver quickly. They ducked into one of the aisles, the leaves brushing against their faces. Naomi crouched low, pulling Caden beside her. Her chest heaved. The thud of footsteps in the distance told her they were being flanked. And then, from beyond the estate's gates, came a sound she hadn't dared to hope for. Sirens. High-pitched, unmistakable, growing louder by the second. Naomi turned her head, eyes wide. The sound was still far off, but not so far that it couldn't reach them in time. She pulled out her phone again, hands shaking, and redialed Carter. This time, he picked up on the first ring. "Naomi," he said breathless, "where are you?" "In the vineyard," she gasped. "We're being chased. They know we know. They tried to grab Caden. We're—" "Stay put," he said firmly. "I'm inside the gates now. Officers are coming in from both directions. I'm heading your way." The line cut. Naomi turned to her son. "Help is here." He nodded once, jaw clenched. They moved again, ducking through the vines until they reached a clearing near a maintenance shed. Naomi was about to step forward when a voice called out from behind. "Going somewhere?" She spun. Ryan. He stood there, no longer smiling, his jacket gone, his white shirt smeared with dirt. His hair was damp with sweat, and his eyes burned with something darker than rage. He didn't run. He simply stepped forward with the same casual control he had always exuded. "You should have trusted me," he said. "We could have had everything." "You mean you could have stolen everything?" Naomi shot back. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" he snarled. "You're just a bitter little woman who got cold feet." Caden stepped in front of his mother, holding the phone like a sword. "She has proof," he said, voice steady, "and you're not going to hurt her." Ryan's lips twisted. "You little brat. You think you're a hero?" Before he could take another step, the pounding of boots filled the clearing. Officers surged from both sides, guns drawn, commands flying through the air like arrows. "Hands where we can see them, on the ground." Ryan turned just as Detective Carter appeared behind him, badge held high, voice calm but unyielding. "This is over," Carter said. Ryan didn't move. For a split second, Naomi feared he would bolt. But he didn't. He simply dropped to his knees. One by one, his accomplices were found. The groomsmen, the security team, even the officiant had ties to the scheme. Each of them was cuffed and escorted out through the same decorative archway they had used to enter the ceremony. Guests stood on the lawn, watching with stunned expressions as their perfect wedding turned into a full-scale criminal takedown. Naomi stood beside her son, her chest still rising and falling with adrenaline. But something inside her had shifted. She had been the prey. Now she was the survivor. Caden looked up at her, his eyes fierce and proud. She pulled him into her arms and held him close, his small body anchoring her to the earth as the sirens faded into the distance. Behind them, the white roses that lined the aisle began to wilt in the heat. Even after the last of the sirens faded into the early afternoon, the silence that followed was deafening. Naomi stood with her arms still wrapped protectively around Caden, their shadows long and unsteady in the bright vineyard sun. Around them, the wedding had become a crime scene. Uniformed officers moved methodically, their radios crackling with static, the click of handcuffs punctuating the uneasy quiet. Guests had been escorted out in stunned confusion, some still in disbelief, others clutching their phones, no doubt texting friends or recording the aftermath. The spell had been broken, and all that remained was wreckage. Naomi's legs ached. Her dress, once elegant and carefully fitted, now hung from her in torn strips, the hem soaked with dirt and sweat. Her face, so perfectly made up that morning, was streaked with mascara and dried tears. Yet she held herself upright, refusing to let exhaustion collapse her. She couldn't. Not yet. Detective Carter approached, his demeanor calm, composed, but his eyes filled with something that flickered between concern and restrained anger. He carried a notepad in one hand, but it remained closed. Naomi could tell this was no ordinary case for him. This was personal. "We're bringing them all in," he said quietly, glancing back toward the estate. "Not just Ryan. His brother, the officiant, the so-called security team. We've already linked 2 of them to prior shell company fraud investigations in Miami and Phoenix." Naomi nodded slowly, her mind trying to catch up. "How close did they get?" she asked. "Before I found out?" Carter's jaw tightened. "Close. Too close. They forged your signature on several internal ownership transfer documents, fake grant deeds, power of attorney forms. Some were almost finalized with remote notaries. If you had signed the marriage license, it would have added a layer of legitimacy. They would have moved fast, started seizing your company assets through court filings while you were still on your honeymoon. Naomi felt her stomach twist. "And Caden?" she asked, lowering her voice. He looked at the boy, who stood a few feet away, sipping from a bottle of water handed to him by one of the officers. He would have been collateral. They weren't planning to keep him around. Naomi had to sit down. She lowered herself onto a flat stone at the edge of the path, every bone in her body vibrating with horror. Her arms folded tightly across her chest as if they alone could keep her from shattering. The image was unbearable. Her son left in the care of monsters while she faced jail time for a crime she never committed. A single signature, one legal document, and her entire life could have been stolen, her name destroyed, her son lost. Carter crouched beside her. "You did everything right. You believed your son when it mattered. That alone saved both of you." She nodded again, but couldn't find words. The adrenaline had started to ebb, and now the exhaustion seeped in like a rising tide. She leaned forward, cradling her face in her hands. After a long pause, Carter spoke again. "We'll need full statements from both of you. I know it's a lot, but the more detail we get now, the easier it'll be to ensure these men don't walk free." Naomi lifted her head. "I'll do whatever you need. But Caden, I want him somewhere safe. He doesn't need to hear all of this." "We have a counselor on the way," Carter said. "We'll keep him nearby, but give him some space. He's already been through too much." Naomi stood again, steadier now, and walked toward her son. He looked up at her, and for the first time since their flight from the estate began, his expression softened. "You okay, baby?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Are we safe now?" Her throat closed and she pulled him into another hug. "Yes, we are." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Naomi gave her statement, recounting everything from the moment she met Ryan to the moment she and Caden were cornered in the vineyard. She left nothing out. Not the strange guest list, not the forged emails Marcy had sent, not the moment Caden burst into her suite holding the phone that saved their lives. Carter listened without interrupting, scribbling notes quickly, occasionally underlining something with thick strokes. Other officers moved through the house with forensic teams, photographing, bagging evidence, collecting discarded phones, files, and laptops from the rooms Ryan had occupied. The estate, once pristine, now looked like a stage after the curtain had fallen, exposed for the illusion it had always been. Outside, reporters had begun to gather at the estate gates. Word was spreading fast. A wedding turned criminal takedown was too juicy to ignore. Drones buzzed in the sky, and flashbulbs popped over the hedges. Naomi knew it was only a matter of time before her name would appear online, her face attached to headlines. She would not be just Naomi Thompson, business owner. She would become the bride who escaped, or the wedding scam survivor. Her story would be consumed, debated, and shared by strangers. But, strangely, she didn't care. They could say what they wanted. She had her son, her freedom, and the truth. When they finally left the estate grounds, it was in an unmarked police SUV. Caden sat beside her in the back seat, silent but alert, his hand still in hers. Naomi leaned her head back against the seat, staring out at the winding road. Her body ached. Her eyes were dry. Her mind would not stop racing. Detective Carter drove them to the station himself. He led them into a private office, offered her water, then excused himself to coordinate the charges being filed. Naomi sat quietly for a moment, staring at the framed certificates on the wall, the cityscape outside the window. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly. Everything felt too bright, too clean, too unreal after the chaos of the day. A few minutes later, an officer entered with a change of clothes. "Courtesy of a friend," he said with a small smile. "Melinda, I think." Naomi nearly cried with relief. She took the bag gratefully and stepped into the adjoining restroom. She peeled off the shredded remains of her wedding dress and stared at herself in the mirror. Her skin was bruised and scratched, her hair tangled, her eyes rimmed with red. But underneath all of it, she saw something else. Strength, resolve, fire. She dressed quickly, pulling on jeans and a sweatshirt. When she returned to the office, Caden was sitting on the couch, coloring quietly with crayons that someone had given him. Naomi sat beside him, her arm around his shoulders. They waited. When Carter returned, he looked tired but satisfied. "They're all being processed. You'll get updates on the hearings. There'll likely be some press pressure, but we've redacted Caden's identity from everything. You won't have to speak to the media unless you choose to." "Thank you," Naomi said quietly. He nodded. "I mean it, Naomi. You and your son, what you did today took courage. You didn't just protect yourselves. You stopped a network that's likely been operating for years." Naomi smiled faintly. "I'm just glad I listened to my child." Carter's expression softened. "Smartest move you ever made." They left the station just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the city skyline. The air was cooler now, the golden haze of early evening casting long shadows across the pavement. Naomi held Caden's hand as they stepped outside, their footsteps slow, heavy, but free. She had no idea what came next. Her business would need careful auditing. Her personal information had been compromised. She would likely face weeks, maybe months, of legal cleanup. But none of that scared her. Not anymore. Caden looked up at her as they walked. "Do we have to go back to that place?" he asked softly. "No," she said immediately. "We never have to go back there." "Good." They stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light. Naomi glanced down at him and, for the first time that day, truly smiled. "You were amazing today," she said. "You saved me." He looked up, his eyes older than they should have been. "We saved each other." The light changed, and they crossed the street, hand in hand. Behind them, the city kept moving, unaware that two of its quietest citizens had just faced something darker than most would ever know. But they had faced it together, and they had won. The following morning, sunlight streamed gently through the half-open blinds of the guest room where Naomi and Caden had spent the night. It was a modest hotel suite provided discreetly by the police department while the investigation continued. There were no chandeliers or silk sheets, no polished marble or coordinated decor like the estate she had fled just hours before. Just quiet, neutral walls and the scent of fresh linen. But for Naomi, it was the safest place she had ever been. She had hardly slept. The kind of exhaustion she carried was not one that a night of rest could cure. Her body ached, but her mind remained alert, spinning through every detail, every lie, every almost. Caden still slept, curled beneath the blanket, one hand resting beneath his cheek. His face, softened by dreams, bore little trace of the horror he had seen. Naomi sat beside him now, dressed in the same sweatshirt and jeans from the night before, cradling a mug of weak hotel coffee, her eyes watching the world through the window. The city outside moved indifferently. Cars passed, people walked, horns honked, no different than any other day. And yet, for her, everything had changed. Her phone buzzed gently on the nightstand. She reached for it quickly, trying not to wake Caden. A text from Carter. "We've frozen all accounts connected to Ryan's shell companies. You should contact your business attorney." And, "Naomi, well done." She read it twice, then opened the browser to scan the news. As expected, the story had exploded. Dozens of headlines, some factual, others bordering on theatrical, dominated the local feed. "Runaway bride exposes groom's $1 million fraud at wedding ceremony," read one. Another showed a blurred photo of her in the torn dress, clutching Caden's hand. "Mother and son escape orchestrated scam. Recording sparks arrests at high society wedding." Naomi's name had not been published, thanks to Carter's insistence. Caden's identity had been kept entirely confidential, but she knew it wouldn't last forever. As the case grew, as charges were filed, as reporters dug deeper, the curtain would fall. Her company might be scrutinized. Her story might be twisted. But the truth, she reminded herself, didn't need to be loud. It only needed to survive. Her phone buzzed again. This time a message from Melinda. "Just saw the news. I'm coming by with clean clothes and groceries. I love you. You did the right thing. So proud of you. See you soon." Naomi smiled despite the weight on her shoulders. Melinda had been her rock for years. Through Caden's birth, through the long nights packing orders for her startup, through heartbreak and recovery, Melinda had never once walked away. And now, once again, she was showing up when it counted. By the time Caden stirred and sat up, rubbing his eyes with sleepy confusion, the hotel room had already begun to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like the place where healing might begin. "Is it over?" he asked groggily. Naomi moved to his side. "The worst part is, but we've got a few more steps to go." "Do we have to go back to the house?" She shook her head quickly. "No, we're not going back there." Caden lay back for a moment, staring at the ceiling. "I don't want to wear tuxedos anymore." She laughed softly. "Deal." They ate breakfast in silence. Hotel eggs and toast, orange juice in small plastic cups. Naomi's appetite was weak, but she made herself eat for Caden's sake. When Melinda arrived, the familiar warmth in her presence made Naomi exhale for the first time in hours. She entered without fuss, carrying 2 bags, one with clothes, one with food, and immediately wrapped Naomi in a hug that lasted longer than words could reach. "I would have been there," she said, eyes shining, "if I had known what he was." "You couldn't have known," Naomi said, pulling away slightly. "None of us did." Melinda turned to Caden, crouching to his level. "And you, young man, you are a hero." He blushed, glancing away. "No joke," Melinda added. "You saved your mama. You saved yourself. That's more than most grown men do in their lifetime." He gave a small smile, the first real one since the escape. After lunch, they sat together and reviewed documents sent over by Naomi's lawyer. It was worse than she had feared. The fraudulent documents included 3 forged notarizations and a falsified email chain designed to look like Naomi had approved a merger. They had even fabricated a story about her being in rehab for depression as justification for the transfer of power. Had she signed the marriage license, everything would have gone through seamlessly under the guise of shared spousal control. Her attorney assured her that the quick exposure had prevented most of the damage. The brand, her bank accounts, and her property were all safe, for now. But legal proceedings would drag out. Depositions, hearings, evidence reviews, it could take months, possibly years. Still, the worst was over. She had time now. She had truth. That evening, Carter called again. His voice was softer than usual, less official. "I wanted you to know something," he said. Ryan cracked during the second round of questioning. Turns out this wasn't his first time doing this. We've got evidence he ran similar scams in 3 other states. Same method, different names. But this time, he messed up. He underestimated you. Naomi was quiet. Then she asked, "Do you think he ever meant any of it? Did he ever care?" Carter paused. "I think he cared about what you represented. Stability, success, vulnerability. But no, I don't think he ever loved you. He's not capable of that." Naomi closed her eyes. The final nail. And yet, it didn't hurt the way she thought it would. It wasn't grief anymore. It was relief. Before bed, she sat with Caden and helped him finish a puzzle he had brought from home. The picture was of a galaxy. Purple and gold swirls, stars like silver dust. "Do you think we'll be okay?" he asked. Naomi kissed the top of his head. "I think we already are." As he fell asleep, she remained awake beside him, watching the shadows on the ceiling shift with the city lights. For the first time in days, there were no footsteps chasing them, no voices whispering lies, no wedding march turned funeral dirge. In the days that followed, Naomi moved them into a short-term rental, a 2-bedroom apartment with sunlight in every room and a small garden terrace where Caden could plant strawberries. She returned to her office, greeted her small team with cautious hugs and reassurances. They had been worried, but they had stood by her. Orders had slowed due to the negative press, but now they were pouring in again, bolstered by people who admired what she had survived. She sat at her desk one afternoon, the same place where she had built everything from nothing, and looked at the framed photo of Caden on her shelf. His smile, genuine and wide, stared back at her. And for the first time, Naomi felt anchored, grounded. The world would move on, but she wouldn't forget. She didn't want to. Every scar taught her something. Every betrayal carved space for wisdom, and every step she took away from that altar was a step back toward herself. The future, once wrapped in white lace and illusions, now stretched before her in its raw, honest truth. And that, she thought, was more sacred than any vow. Naomi stood on the balcony of their temporary apartment, watching as the first rays of morning light reached across the city skyline. The sunrise painted everything gold, rooftops, clouds, the tops of trees shifting with the early spring wind. The quiet hum of distant traffic was the only sound, and for once it felt soothing. Her arms folded over her chest, the coffee in her hand cooling fast, but she didn't move. She was lost in thought, her gaze not fixed on anything in particular, but turned inward, following the slow current of everything that had brought her here. Inside, Caden was still asleep. He had kicked off his blankets during the night, his small frame tangled in sheets, his cheek pressed against the pillow in a peaceful sprawl that Naomi hadn't seen since before the wedding. No, not wedding. She no longer thought of it that way. That day, that dress, that place, it didn't deserve the word. It had been a performance, a trap. What she and Caden had done in the face of it, that had been real. She had spent the past 2 weeks trying to make sense of everything while staying ahead of the damage. Her attorney had confirmed the charges were being processed. The district attorney planned to pursue the case aggressively. The exposure of Ryan and his fraudulent operation had stirred more than public outrage. It had embarrassed investors, made law enforcement look complicit through their previous inaction, and ignited a wider investigation into similar schemes across state lines. Naomi had already given multiple recorded statements and handed over every document she could find. Carter, true to his word, kept her updated without pressuring her for anything more than she could give. He made sure the department's resources were available whenever she needed reassurance or support. She had begun to trust him in a way she hadn't thought possible for someone in a badge. It wasn't just that he had helped save her, it was that he had listened, believed, and acted. The media pressure had died down somewhat. Naomi's name had eventually been leaked, but not by her doing. A former associate of Ryan's had sold the story to a tabloid, including a blurry photo of Naomi holding Caden's hand on the courthouse steps after filing a restraining order. The article had been filled with inaccuracies, claiming she had been a gold digger who turned on her meal ticket, that she had faked the drama to promote her brand. But most readers hadn't bought it. The real story had already struck a chord with people. A single mother, deceived and targeted, fighting back not with lawyers or bodyguards, but with her son and the truth. That was the story people wanted. That was what stayed with them. The brand, after an initial dip in orders due to the scandal, was now experiencing something Naomi hadn't anticipated, a surge. Women from all over the country were flooding her inbox with messages of support, stories of similar betrayals, thanks for speaking out, and promises to never stop buying from a company led by someone like her. The attention was overwhelming at times. She didn't want to be a symbol, she just wanted her life back. But she understood the responsibility now. Her survival had given others something to believe in. She owed it to herself and to Caden to honor that. She stepped back into the apartment and closed the balcony door behind her. The sound stirred Caden awake. He blinked up at her and stretched. "Is it morning already?" he mumbled, voice still thick with sleep. "Yeah," she said with a soft smile. "But you can sleep in if you want. No school today." He sat up slowly. "Can we go to the park later?" "Of course," she said. "We'll bring lunch." He nodded and lay back down, pulling the blanket over his head. Naomi walked into the small kitchen and reheated her coffee. The scent filled the room, familiar and grounding. She thought about how much had changed in just a few weeks, how quickly life had unraveled and begun to restitch itself. Later that morning, they walked through the park together, the air cool but not cold, spring flowers blooming along the pathways. Caden ran ahead, laughing as he kicked at a stray soccer ball that another child had left near a bench. Naomi watched him, her heart swelling with pride and sorrow. He had been forced to grow up too quickly, to understand things no child should have to, but he hadn't hardened. He hadn't lost his light. They sat beneath a tree to eat sandwiches. Caden pulled out a notebook and began sketching something, his new favorite habit. He said it helped him sort things out. Naomi peeked over his shoulder. It was a picture of the vineyard, the estate, but this time it was burning. Flames climbed the pillars and thick smoke twisted into the sky. In the foreground, a small figure held the hand of a taller one, walking away toward the hills. "You okay?" she asked gently. He nodded. "It's just a drawing." "I know," she said, "but if you ever want to talk about what happened, I'm always here." He looked up at her. "I don't want to forget. I just don't want to be afraid anymore." Naomi reached over and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "That's brave and honest. Do you think he's still thinking about us?" he asked. "Ryan?" Caden nodded. Naomi took a deep breath. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter, because we're thinking about what comes next, not what we left behind." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You think something like that could happen again, with someone else?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes searched the sky above the trees. A hawk soared overhead, silent and strong. "I think bad people don't always look bad," she said at last, "and good people don't always look perfect. But we learn, we see things we didn't see before, and we trust ourselves next time." He seemed to accept that. That night, after dinner, Naomi sat at her desk with a cup of tea and began drafting a new idea. She didn't tell anyone at first, not even Melinda. It was something she had been thinking about since the trial hearings began. She wanted to create a resource center for women in business who had faced predatory financial schemes. A place to learn, to share, to defend themselves better. So many of the women who had written to her shared similar stories of manipulation, of losing companies or homes or reputations to men who had promised safety and delivered sabotage. The name came easily. Reclaim. A space for women to reclaim ownership of business, of safety, of trust. She drafted the mission statement, outlined a basic proposal, and began reaching out to a few contacts she trusted: journalists, legal advocates, entrepreneurs. The response was almost immediate. Within a week, she had commitments for funding, speaking events, and legal aid workshops. Carter introduced her to a nonprofit director who offered mentorship. Melinda took on the role of communications coordinator without being asked. Naomi worked late into the nights, but this time it didn't feel like work. It felt like purpose. One evening, as she shut down her laptop and stretched, she found Caden standing at the door rubbing his eyes. "I had a weird dream," he said. "Want to talk about it?" He nodded. "We were in a dark room and I couldn't find the door. But then I remembered your voice, and it helped me see a little light." Naomi crouched in front of him, her chest tight. "You'll never be alone in the dark. Ever." He leaned into her, and she held him until he drifted off in her arms. The next morning, they stood together outside the courthouse for the arraignment. Ryan was brought in wearing cuffs, his expression blank. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't glare or cry. She didn't need to. The justice system would do its part, and she had already done hers. Caden stood beside her, dressed in his best shirt, his hand in hers. "You think this is the end?" he asked. Naomi looked at the building, at the press waiting, at the people who whispered as they passed. "No," she said, "I don't think it ever really ends. There's always someone lurking in the shadows." Caden nodded thoughtfully. "But now we know how to find the light." They walked away from the courthouse, the city bathed in morning gold, and behind them, shadows stretched long across the pavement. But they didn't look back, because the story, the real story, was just beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Check out our other videos for even more powerful stories, and share this one with someone who needs to see it.